Hi everyone, this is Professor Casey again. Welcome back. Today we're picking up where we left off last time from Chapter 13 about American expansion westward, and now we're going to discuss specifically Mexican territory and the almost inevitable Mexican-American War. Okay, so this is the period that includes the Alamo. This is what really ends up branching America down into an almost transcontinental nation. Okay, this is what causes us to absorb the Southwest. And so we'll get into the details of what makes all that possible. Now, the major focus here in the wild card, so to speak, when it comes to gaining access to the Southwest and expanding American territory westward is Texas. Okay? Now, in the 1820s, the U.S. actually offers to purchase Texas from Mexico 2 different times, and Mexico constantly turns down the United States. Okay, it claims that it doesn't want us to have it for one reason or another, whether we're not offering enough money or they don't want to abandon the territory because Texas's climate ends up being a big mixture of several different climates at once. Okay, if you go into East Texas, it's very hot and humid. If you go into North Central Texas, it tends to be very temperate. And the further south you go, again, you get into a Gulf coastal region. Out west, it's all desert. Okay, so it's a very large mixture of several different climates. And the man responsible for promoting American settlement in Texas is Stephen F. Austin, okay, the man who, for whom the state capital is named. Okay? And he is the one who convinces the Mexican government that he can actually recruit 300 American families to settle along the Gulf Coast as a kind of buffer against the Comanche. Okay, because the Comanche, remember, still retain most of the actual territory in South and Central Texas and are actually raiding into Mexican territory at this particular time. So he says that if we can have a white presence here, then perhaps we can actually end up scaring off the Comanche a bit. Okay. In reality, though, he's really more of a land speculator, and he realizes that Texas, East Texas in particular, and along the Gulf Coast, has prime land for the cotton industry. And so Americans begin to settle in East Texas in Austin's Anglo quote-unquote colony. Okay. And each family is given 177 acres, along with thousands of acres of common pasture. Okay, so this is still before we get into individually owned land with fences and so forth, right? All of the cattle and so forth that are brought over are given basically a common pasture region. By 1830, we have 20,000 whites and about 1,000 black slaves living in coastal Texas. So only 5 years later, that number increases to 35,000 whites and 3,000 slaves. And now, suddenly, the Hispanic Tejanos and the Indians living there are completely outnumbered. Okay, so this is actually ballooned up far past what Mexico anticipated was going to happen. And by April of 1830, Mexico ends up outlawing further immigration from the United States because they realize that this could potentially lead to an armed insurrection if allowed to continue. Now, in 1834, if we back up a little bit here, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna is the president of Mexico, okay? And he begins to consolidate power here by suspending the National Congress, okay? And therefore declares himself to be an autocratic dictator. Now, Austin is immediately targeted by Santa Anna for bringing too many Americans over, and suddenly white Texans are all up in arms over this, right? Because, again, Austin is the one responsible for them being able to settle there in the first place. So, in 1835, a large contingency of white Texans and black slave communities end up banding together, and they end up outnumbering the Tejanos 10-1. Austin proclaims that Texas should be Americanized here and, moreover, should be brought into the Union as a slave state. So, unfortunately, for those of us who live in Texas here, Texas was originally targeted for the slave industry and for cotton in particular. Okay. And Austin calls for an armed revolt against Mexico over this. Santa Anna, meanwhile, calls for all Americans to be expelled, all Texans living there to be disarmed, and any rebels arrested and executed as quote-unquote pirates. By fall, Texans have launched a large-scale rebellion against Santa Anna, which is, very, very outnumbered on the Texan side. Okay, we have 30,000 Texans at this point against roughly 7 million members of the Mexican army. And of course, the most famous or infamous instance in Texas history that becomes kind of a rallying cry for a long period of time is the Battle of the Alamo. Okay, and this occurs when a 3,000-man contingency of Santa Anna's army ends up clashing with fewer than 200 Texans, Tejanos, and a volunteer army of Texas at the Spanish mission, the Alamo, which is in modern-day San Antonio. And of course, we have several very famous names and faces who come out of this particular battle, okay, none of whom actually survive, by the way. One is James Bowie, better known as Jim Bowie. Okay, he's the commander of the Texas Volunteer Army. And he himself is actually a slave trader. Okay, he actually comes from Louisiana and is a land speculator, specifically looking at Texas to see what lands can be taken and used for the cotton industry. Okay, so he migrates to Texas in 1828 for this very reason. Okay, and he's very well known for being a gambler, for being a heavy drinker, and getting in duels with men who he normally kills with the long-bladed knife, now known as the Bowie knife. We also have William Barrett Travis, okay, who is only 26 years old. Okay, he's the commander of the Texas Regular Army. And he actually leaves behind a failed marriage in Alabama along with a pregnant wife and a 2-year-old son. Okay, and so leaving all this behind along with several debts. Okay, so he's actually had a very rough start to his young life here. And for the Alamo to be his ultimate destiny here is kind of a bittersweet ending, really. What makes Travis so outstanding here is he actually is the one who refuses orders to retreat from the Alamo. Okay, the Army of Texas specifically tells him under direct orders to retreat and give the Alamo over, and Travis refuses. Okay? If he had accepted, right, it could be possible that the people who were garrisoned there might actually have survived, but it's difficult to say. And of course, probably the most famous is David Crockett. Okay, we've already discussed his exploits during the War of 1812, right under Andrew Jackson. Okay, he's a frontiersman, and he's an anti-Jacksonian Whig in Congress. Okay, so ironically, even though he served under Jackson, he becomes part of the exact opposite political party to what Jackson embodies. Okay? So Crockett actually has a very long and decorated past. As a folklore hero, of being an individual who's a storyteller, a hunter, a sharpshooter, and all these kinds of things. Now, in February of 1836, Santa Anna demands that the Alamo be surrendered to the Mexican army. And Bowie at this point is actually bedridden. We don't know exactly with what. There haven't been any forensic explanations given for what exactly ailed him at this point. It appears to have been something to have, again, kept him completely bedridden because he was a very large man, some kind of a fever, and some people have even suggested that perhaps he suffered from cirrhosis of the liver, or perhaps even came down with some primitive form of the flu or something along those lines. But Bowie actually gives the command of the Alamo over to Travis, okay? And rather than Travis actually surrendering, okay, he actually answers Santa Anna's demands with cannon fire instead. Okay? 12 days of fighting later, the Mexicans are pushed back. They have several heavy losses, and it seems like the Texans might actually be able to hold the Alamo. On March 2nd, delegates from all 59 Texas towns, right, specifically towns that are populated by whites at this point, it's worth noting that, end up meeting at Washington on the Brazos, which is 150 miles northeast of San Antonio, and they sign a Texas Declaration of Independence and draft a constitution for the state. Okay, so this is where we have the proclamation of a Republic of Texas. And Sam Houston here, who we've also discussed as being part of the War of 1812, served alongside Crockett under Jackson, is named the commander of the Texas Army. On March 6th, Santa Anna's men launched the final attack on the Alamo before dawn here. And by the time we actually get to the end of the day, everyone except for a handful of women and children and Travis's slave, Joe, are all killed. Okay, so Travis, Bowie, Crockett are all killed here. Sam Houston is actually in a completely different location. But over 600 Mexicans are killed here, again, by fewer than 200 Texas volunteers. Now, 2 weeks after the Alamo occurs, the Mexicans end up defeating the Texans at the Battle of Toledo. Okay, and the Battle of Toledo is just a little bit north of San Antonio, if I'm not mistaken. The Mexicans capture 465 Texans, and they march them to Goliad. Okay, Goliad is another mission location that I believe is, again, I believe this is in the northwest of San Antonio. On March 27th, which is Palm Sunday, over 300 Texans are marched out of Goliad and are executed. And now Sam Houston becomes the deciding force behind what becomes known as the Texas Revolution. And Sam Houston has got a very colorful, detailed background as well. He's born to a pair of Scots-Irish immigrants who live in Virginia. He runs away from home at the age of 16, lives among the Cherokee, and they give him the nickname the Raven. Of course, as we've already said, he serves under Andrew Jackson alongside David Crockett, and becomes over time a federal Indian agent, an attorney, a congressman, a commanding general of the Tennessee militia, and a governor, all before the age of 30. Okay, so he already has a very long string of credentials attached to him. In 1829, he resigns the Tennessee governorship after his young wife leaves him. Okay, and he falls into a severe state of depression here, begins drinking very heavily, and is only prevented from committing suicide by some strange otherworldly vision that he has a destiny to fulfill out west. He ends up rejoining the Cherokee for a while, marries into the tribe, and eventually becomes a negotiator among several Indian tribes and the federal government. Okay. And he ends up earning a new nickname here, Big Drunk, for obvious reasons. In 1832, he moves to Texas at the behest of Andrew Jackson and reports that Texas at this point is ripe for revolt against Mexico. Okay, so it seems like his arrival very closely intimates what we've been building up to here. April 21st of 1836, Santa Anna's 1,600-man force is trapped at the San Jacinto River by 900 Texans. And the battle only lasts for 18 minutes, but the Texans end up spending the next 2 hours completely slaughtering Mexican soldiers. So even though Mexico surrenders after 18 minutes, Texans take their time and actually very quickly murder the prisoners over the course of 2 hours. So 630 Mexicans are killed, 700 are captured and are allowed to remain as prisoners, and only 9 Texans are killed. Okay, so this is a major routing victory for Texas. Santa Anna, meanwhile, is captured, and the story behind his capture is pseudo-historical. Right? Some people have claimed this and some have denied it, but allegedly he was caught with a prostitute in his tent whose name was Yellow Rose, and this is where we get allegedly the song The Yellow Rose of Texas. Believe that if you wish. He ends up signing a treaty with the Texans, ending the revolution after a period of only 7 weeks. So later in the year, Texas ends up legalizing slavery. Unfortunately, that's one of its first acts. It bans all free blacks from living in the state. Again, not the greatest way to start out, Texas. And it elects Sam Houston as its first president. Okay? Votes that it wants to be annexed into the United States. Now, to get back to the national narrative here, and kind of the background while all this is occurring south in Texas, we have, in the election of 1841, we have William Henry Harrison ascend to the presidency. Okay? And he is the oldest president when he's elected at this point. He's 68 years old. He's also the very first Whig president we have in office. And the Whigs at this point also control Congress. Okay? They've opposed Andrew Jackson. They've opposed Jacksonian democracy. Right? They don't like the very heavy-handed common man's white supremacist viewpoint that's been espoused by Jackson up until this point. And so they began to promote a very strong federal government instead of states' rights. And Harrison actually ends up becoming the very first president to die in office. Okay? The cause behind his death has been open for speculation for quite some time, and several people have come up with different explanations here. He ends up giving his inaugural speech in a driving rainstorm. for one thing, and which has led many people to believe that he may have contracted pneumonia because he ends up dying 1 month after his inauguration, okay, before he can actually put anything through in office. Okay, and so the presidency is left to his vice president, John Tyler. Okay, and Tyler, his ascendancy to the presidency is actually praised by Andrew Jackson as being a part of divine providence somehow, because Jackson could not stand Harrison at all. Okay, remember, William Henry Harrison was a hero of the War of 1812. Okay, he was the one responsible for the Battle of Tippecanoe. Okay. And John Quincy Adams, meanwhile, dismisses Tyler as being a slave-driving political sectarian. Okay, so again, we have another instance here where a president has ascended to the presidency and is also a slave owner. Henry Clay, meanwhile, who is the congressman from Kentucky, believes that he can dominate Tyler. Okay, and Tyler actually ends up fighting back instead. Okay, he's has a more dominant personality than some of his predecessors had, and is willing to actually stand his ground. Tyler, meanwhile, is actually the youngest serving president at this point. Okay, very stark contrast here. Tyler is 51. And he's a former state legislator, that is. He's a governor, a congressman, a senator, and he is characterized as being a kind individual, being stubbornly independent, and charming. Okay, so again, he is got kind of this gentleman planter persona that's being embodied here. And again, he is partially a sectarian, though he has to actually adopt a few nationalist policies along the way. Now, again, when it comes to politics, he was originally a Democrat, okay, supported the idea of states' rights here, and believed that states had a constitutional right to secede, okay, and this would have made him very, very unpopular with individuals like Abraham Lincoln only a few decades later. And he only becomes a Whig when Andrew Jackson ends up condemning the nullification of South Carolina. So again, on the principle that states have the right to secede from the Union, he believes that the federal government does not have the right to intervene in that. And he ends up vetoing Clay's call for the creation of another Bank of the United States, but agrees to repeal the Independent Treasury Act. So again, he could have allowed commerce in the country to become a little bit more stabilized by the introduction of a third Bank of the United States. But again, such a thing doesn't actually occur until we get to the dawn of the war, the Great War, World War I. Clay, meanwhile, calls Tyler a traitor, convinces his entire cabinet to resign except for Daniel Webster, okay, remember the senator from Massachusetts. And suddenly there's this long conflict that emerges between Henry Clay and John Tyler. Okay, Tyler ends up replacing his entire cabinet with anti-Jacksonian Democrats who have turned onto the Whig side. And suddenly the Whig Party ends up expelling Tyler as well. Okay, so Tyler is the first president that we have since George Washington who is not affiliated with any political party. And Texas, meanwhile, is referred to by Tyler's wife as the great object of his ambition. Okay, so John Tyler is the first president who really begins to latch on to the idea of annexing Texas, although he doesn't actually get to see it put into play while he's in office. Funny bit of trivia about John Tyler, too. He had so many children and so many grandchildren over the course of his lifetime, and spaced out so far apart that some of his actual first-generation grandchildren are still alive today. Now, in February of 1844, there is an international incident that occurs on the Potomac River. Okay, and this surrounds the introduction of a new steam propeller-driven boat called the USS Princeton. Okay, and the Princeton is essentially putting on an exposition here, right? An exhibition, I should say. For the people of Washington, D.C. Okay, it actually has several dignitaries, several members of the executive branch on board the ship, and it's sailing down the Potomac in the middle of February. Okay, it's cold out, and there is a large new exploding shell gun on board called the Peacemaker. Okay, you see a replica of it here at the top right. Okay, and this cannon is firing off several salutes, right, as it goes down the river. Okay. And on the very last time that the gun is fired, several individuals are actually gathered around it watching it fire, and the gun itself ends up exploding. Okay, and it ends up killing 6 people around and injuring 20 others in the process. Okay. The Secretary of State, Abel Upshur, is the one who replaced Daniel Webster, okay, as Secretary of State. If I'm not mistaken, I believe he is the one who's actually fully decapitated by the blast. Okay, he was actually bent over the gun when it went off, and the shrapnel came up and hit him directly in the face. The Secretary of the Navy had only been in office 10 days at this point, a young man named Thomas Gilmer. Captain Beverly Kennan, he's the head of the Bureau of Construction and Repair. He is also killed. Virgil Maxey, who is a Maryland attorney. David Gardiner, who is a New York lawyer and the father-in-law of the president. And a man named Armistead, who is President Tyler's personal valet. Okay, it's worth noting, too, that Tyler and his wife were below deck when this gun exploded. Okay, if they had been on deck, they could have been seriously injured or killed in the process. So Tyler runs up onto the deck to find out what's happened and has to come back down and tell his wife that her father has just been killed. And Tyler uses this accident as a very, it seems in hindsight anyway, like a suspicious means of appointing several Southern Democrats into key positions. Okay, because remember, he had already been expelled by the Whig Party. Okay, so it seems like this was an opportunity for him to gain support from the opposite political party in the meantime. And meanwhile, the designer of the gun itself was actually charged with, with being responsible for this. It was a man who was actually a foreigner who I believe was from Sweden at the time. John C. Calhoun is therefore named the Secretary of State. Remember, John C. Calhoun was a South Carolina sectionalist. And in April of 1844, Calhoun ends up signing a treaty for Texas to be annexed. Okay. He declares that Texas is going to be instrumental in keeping slavery as an institution. Unfortunately for him, though, the Northerners end up downvoting the annexation 35-16. Okay, so Texas actually does not become a part of the Union for several years thereafter. So not until 1845, I beg your pardon, so a little over a year and a half. Texas is therefore considered a new state before Tyler even leaves office. Okay, this is kind of the last effort that ends up happening here. So the last act of Congress while Tyler is in office is for Texas to be added as a new state. So, and it's actually annexed by joint resolution rather than a 2/3 treaty vote. Okay, so a majority vote in both houses of Congress ends up causing Texas to become part of the Union. March 1st of 1845, Tyler signs the resolution and admits Texas as the 28th state on December 29th. Now, when it comes to the election of 1844, before Tyler fully leaves office here, Texas as an issue is kept out of the election because of how divisive it is. Okay, there's so much argumentation over what should be done about Texas, whether there should be an armed intervention or not, and all this kind of stuff. Okay. So Henry Clay ends up running again for the presidency. This is his 3rd time trying to get involved in this. Okay, he runs for the Whig Party. Martin Van Buren, who has already served a term in office as president, tries to run again on the Democratic ticket. And James Polk, who ends up being nominated by Andrew Jackson, ends up taking Martin Van Buren's place. Okay, so again, essentially, Andrew Jackson has abandoned his immediate successor and friend, Martin Van Buren, in favor of James Polk. Okay, mainly because Polk is so interested in getting Texas. And John Tyler is initially independent here, but ends up dropping out of the race, doesn't want to be reelected, and ends up endorsing Polk as well. Okay. And Polk here is actually a very loyal Democrat. Okay, he ends up running as a what we call a dark horse candidate on the 9th ballot. So in other words, he had enough of a steady campaign to where all the other individuals ended up getting weeded out in the process, whereas he stayed relatively stable. And he ends up winning the election specifically because of a pro-Texas platform, okay, and the insistence that the U.S. dominate the entirety of the Oregon Territory. Okay? He doesn't want to share it with Great Britain anymore. And Polk ends up breaking Tyler's record here. He becomes the youngest president at the age of 49. And Polk ends up pursuing four major goals as president. Okay, he wants to reduce tariffs on imports, okay, so we can start actually doing business overseas again. He wants to reestablish an independent treasury, settle the Oregon boundary dispute with Great Britain so that we can maintain complete control of it, acquire California from Mexico, and add Oregon, California, and New Mexico to the Union in order to fill out the continent, along with Texas. In June of 1846, James Buchanan ends up signing the Buchanan-Pakenham Treaty, and this extends the U.S. border up to the 49th parallel. And again, Polk is very Jacksonian when it comes to his nature, when it comes to his politics. He's anti-tariff, anti-national bank. He's a sectionalist. And he satisfies the South, but ends up angering a lot of Northerners and Westerners, specifically because of how Jacksonian he actually is. And he declares himself to be the hardest working man in the country, which may very well be true, because only 3 months after he ends up leaving office, he dies at the age of 53, okay? Allegedly from working himself to death. Now, March 6th of 1845, Mexico decides to break off relations with the U.S. because it annexes Texas, okay? And Polk, meanwhile, is willing to risk war with Mexico to gain control of California and New Mexico. Okay? Only trick is he does not want to fire the first shot. And so he enlists the aid of General Zachary Taylor, okay, a man who he himself later becomes president. Taylor is ordered to take up positions around Corpus Christi, okay, which is in South Texas. And Mexico immediately views this as an act of war, okay, that the United States is sending troops to the U.S.-Mexico border here. On May 9th, Mexican troops end up attacking U.S. soldiers north of the Rio Grande River. Okay, and again, the Rio Grande River is what separates Texas from Mexico. Okay, so by virtue of annexation here, the United States claims that Mexico has actually invaded U.S. territory. Okay, meanwhile, we've essentially prodded Mexico until they did so. 11 Americans are killed, 5 are wounded, and the rest are taken prisoner. Okay. And Polk, meanwhile, goes to Congress and says, see what happened? Look what I was telling you. Okay. And he declares that Mexico is the aggressor and declares that Congress grant him funds to go to war. Congress agrees. Okay, they give him 50,000 soldiers, and several congressmen realize exactly what Polk has done here. Okay, they know that he has been the one to prod Mexico into this conflict, and several of his critics end up claiming that, quote, this has begun in fraud and will end in disgrace. Okay, so the war over Texas and for the acquisition of New Mexico and California, not the most principled at all. Okay, this is something that ends up causing a pretty big stain on America's reputation, which, of course, by this point has already gained a few stains of itself. Polk also argues that the war is overextending America's boundaries, but not slavery expansion. Okay, and most Southerners and the Democratic contingency at this point know that it's all about slavery. They know that's the only reason that he wants to gain control of this. And he wants New Mexico and California to become slave states. Okay? And eventually, thankfully, they do not. 112,000 whites end up serving eventually in the Mexican-American War, but all blacks are actually banned. And unsurprisingly, the New Englanders and Northern abolitionists have virtually no dog in this fight. Okay, they have no interest in getting involved in this because, again, this is more about the expansion of slavery than it is about gaining territory for the U.S. And again, it's viewed as an excuse to do so more than anything else. And most Northern Whigs begin to accuse Polk of inciting war, okay, getting us involved in a conflict that we didn't need to be involved with. And among them is Abraham Lincoln. Okay? He's a very young congressman at this point who is completely opposed to what Polk decides. Okay? And at this point, this is still before the establishment of the Republican Party again. Okay? So it hasn't made its full reemergence just yet, and it won't for probably about another 5 years. Now, when it comes to the annexation of California here, the U.S. is obviously ill-equipped for another major war. Okay, this is not another situation like the War of 1812, right? We are, our army is still very small. Our economy is still relatively unstable from the last 2 or 3 presidential administrations. So it seems like this would end up ending with disaster if we're not careful. Okay, the regular army of the U.S. is only at about 7,000 men right now. Okay, and Mexico's forces, meanwhile, are well over 32,000. Okay, the only trade-off here is that Mexico's army suffers from a big lack of discipline. It doesn't have a lot of training. The morale is very low, right? Because again, this is largely made up of individuals who have come out after Mexican independence, right? They've already fought a little bit against Spain. They've kicked out some of the Spanish officers, and supplies and munitions are very low. Again, it doesn't enjoy the monetary support of Spain at this point. And meanwhile, the U.S. military ends up swelling to over 79,000 by the end of the war because of volunteerism. Okay, so many people want to see Texas and California and New Mexico as part of the Union that people are willing to actually go to war voluntarily. And there end up being 4 major fronts to the Mexican-American War. Okay, we have southern Texas and northern Mexico. Okay, so these kind of pinkish and kind of dark charcoal gray colors here. We have central Mexico, again down here around Mexico City. We have New Mexico, again, which is part of the kind of yellow contingency here, and of course California, which the yellow also includes. Now on May 18th, Zachary Taylor crosses the Rio Grande here on the border between the dark gray and the pink and occupies Matamoros. Okay, and you see Matamoros down here on the border between Texas and Mexico on the Gulf of Mexico. And Taylor at this point is made overall commander of U.S. forces. And California now becomes a big objective for Polk as well. Okay, he doesn't want to just stop at Texas. He wants to continue all the way to the Pacific coast. In July, the U.S. ends up capturing San Francisco and claims California as part of the U.S. Now, in 1846, Taylor also assaults Monterey. Okay, he moves a little bit further south. Monterey surrenders after 5 days. And Santa Anna, who has been in exile at this point, promises that he will end the war if he is allowed to return. Okay, at this point, Santa Anna has been in Cuba, if I'm not mistaken. And Polk very naively agrees to allow Santa Anna to return to Mexico and vows that he is going to actually pay Santa Anna for Mexican territory. So not only is he going to allow him to return, he's going to write him a check for it, basically. Unsurprisingly here, in hindsight, Santa Anna immediately resumes the presidency, raises an army against U.S. troops, and actually invites the U.S. to surrender to him. From February 22nd to 23rd of 1847, the Battle of Buena Vista is fought. Okay, you see it down here just to the southwest of Monterey. Both sides end up declaring victory, but Mexico's losses are 5 times higher. Okay, so arguably, it seems like the U.S. might have won this one. Mexico continues to lose battles, though refusing to surrender to Polk entirely, primarily because of Santa Anna's determination here. He's already lost face in the Texas Revolution. Seems like he could potentially retake it here, but he's fighting a losing war already. On March 9th, American forces end up staging what is known as the largest amphibious landing ever attempted by U.S. forces at this point without casualties, down here at Veracruz. Okay, and Veracruz is kind of where the curve of the Mexican peninsula is down at the bottom. March 29th, Veracruz ends up surrendering. Okay, so this goes into almost a 3-week-long siege. By August, Scott's forces end up marching on Mexico City, which is 200 miles inland. Okay, and by September, Scott arrives at Mexico City and ends up capturing it. Now, one very brief episode that we'll talk about here that doesn't really gain a lot of attention and most people are not familiar with is something called the St. Patrick's Battalion. Okay, it's estimated that from the beginning of the war, about 7,000 soldiers end up deserting. Okay, and several hundred end up deserting from the U.S. forces and actually go over to the Mexican army. Okay, and most of these individuals are poor Catholic Irish and German immigrants who have faced a lot of interior persecution in the American army because of their faith and because of their nationality. And the Irish in particular, who end up actually sharing the Catholic faith with many Mexicans at this point, end up forming a group called St. Patrick's Battalion in the Mexican army. Okay. And again, there are several debated reasons for why this defection occurs, but the reason with Protestant commanders actually abusing Catholic soldiers is one of the largest. There's a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment in the United States at this point, a lot of nativist sentiment as well, right? People don't like immigrants, they don't like Catholics. Again, this is largely this large nativist response that occurs after this first wave of immigration to the U.S. There's a large attraction to higher wages, right? Mexico is willing to pay more. And again, the religious convictions among Catholics who are both Irish Catholics and Mexican Catholics. In the Mexico City battle, 72 defectors are captured by U.S. forces, and Winfield Scott, who is the individual I mentioned in the last slide, he was another U.S. general, ends up calling for 50 of them to be hanged rather than shot. Okay, and the rest of them are whipped and branded on each cheek with a letter D for deserter. Okay, so individuals who are allowed to survive are permanently, physically deformed, scarred by this. On September 13th of 1847, 29 of these captured defectors are made to stand all day under a wooden gallows with nooses around their necks for 4 hours watching the battle occur. And when the U.S. flag is actually raised and the battle is won, all of them are suddenly hanged simultaneously. So, after the fall of Mexico City, Santa Anna immediately resigns and flees the country once again. January 2nd of 1848, the peace talks begin at Guadalupe Hidalgo outside of the capital, and a month later, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is signed. Okay. This includes Mexico agreeing to border alongside Texas with the Rio Grande, being the deciding division here. All control of California, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, Wyoming, and Colorado is transferred completely over to the United States. This is over half of Mexico's territory at this point. Okay, so this is really a major defeat for Mexico and a major gain for the United States. In 1853, the Gadsden Purchase ends up granting us Arizona and New Mexico as full territories, okay, the remainder of it. Okay, so we only gained part of them before, and this ends up rounding out the continental United States and completely doubles the size of the country, okay, in legitimate terms. Okay, so we've already occupied a great portion of this illegally, but now that we've actually officially gained the territory, now we actually have the full continental United States. And there's a lot of firsts involved in the Mexican-American War. Okay, this is the first time that we have engaged in a major military intervention outside of U.S. territory. It's also the first time that U.S. forces end up conquering and occupying another country. Over 13,000 Americans are killed, and it's estimated that more soldiers in this war die from disease, specifically measles and dysentery, than die in combat. Okay, so 11,550 Americans end up dying from disease. In the percentage of soldiers lost, this is actually the deadliest war in American history at this point. Okay, so out of every 1,000 soldiers, 110 die. And this ends up ending America's economic depression. So all of the fallout from the Jacksonian era, all the political and the economic instability here gets resolved by a major conflict. And of course, this is gradually seen as a war that is surrounded by shame, because this is really more involved with conquest through selfish means and the expansion of slavery, which ultimately goes away in the next 20 years. Now America is officially a transcontinental nation, though, okay? And now the federal government has to dramatically expand in order to keep up with that. And all the acquired territories are soon embroiled over this new controversy over whether to allow slavery in them or not. Okay? And that is what ultimately ends up leading us into the verge of the Civil War and everything beyond.